Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. On this week's episode, dairy farmer Eamon Sheehan and Róisín Horan from Teagasc give insight into the staggering rise of antimicrobial resistance among animal and human populations and key practices to minimise the risk of AMR in your herd.
So I suppose antimicrobials are agents or drugs that either kill or stop the growth of microorganisms. And I suppose when we talk about microorganisms, we're referring to the likes of bacteria, viruses and fungi. And I suppose all of these have the potential to cause infection and disease in both animals and humans. And I suppose onto that as well, antimicrobials are grouped based on the microorganisms that they target. So for example, antibiotics are a type of antimicrobial and they're used against bacteria. And I suppose all antimicrobials have, essential role in protecting human and animal health. And I suppose to follow on to that and to talk about the whole issue of AMR or antibiotic resistance. Here we're usually talking about antibiotic resistance. So that's the ability of bacteria to change. And I suppose as a result, the antibiotic which previously worked is now ineffective against this bacteria and in treating the particular disease or infection.
And a follow on from that, Róisín, you mentioned AMR, and it's something that dairy farmers are becoming more familiar with, and the conversation about AMR within dairy systems is happening. You mentioned in particular it's AMR in relation to antibiotics, and why is this such a relevant conversation, and why are we hearing about it more and more?
I suppose it's so important because it means that the number of antibiotics that we have at our disposal is decreasing. And on dairy farms, the availability and the use of antibiotics is vital in, say, protecting animal health and welfare. It also maintains productivity and it also ensures the production of safe food. So if antibiotics lose their effectiveness, there will be a lack of suitable medicines that farmers can avail of. And that would make common issues such as the likes of, a case of pneumonia or mastitis, for example, harder, if not impossible to treat. And, this ultimately then has knock-on effects on farm profitability and as a result of a loss in productivity. And I suppose it's important to also mention here that, resistant bacteria that arise in animals, humans, or even in the environment can spread from one to the other. So there is various means by which that can happen. And I suppose just to give some examples, it can happen through, say, direct contact with animals. So literally through hands-on interactions with livestock, people can acquire resistant bacteria. Also through the consumption of food. So sometimes resistant bacteria can end up on food products when they're handled or when undercooked food is consumed. And I suppose another pathway then is the environment where resistant bacteria can be transmitted through, say, animal manure that's spread across land as fertilizer, or which is, say, excreted by animals when they're grazing. And I suppose resistant bacteria can enter soil or groundwater in that way. And I suppose in addition to this as well, many antibiotics that are used to treat, say, bacterial diseases in animals are also used in human medicine. So really, as a result of the ability of resistant bacteria to spread between animals, humans and the environment, and because of the crossover between antibiotics used in, say, animal health and human medicine, what happens on farm has an effect elsewhere. So if we take, for example, a particular antibiotic that is used on a dairy farm and resistant bacteria develop, I suppose this can spread and have consequences in terms of human health. And I suppose just to briefly mention some of those consequences. So antibiotics in human medicine is crucial for the treatment of different infectious diseases, and in surgical procedures. So if if antibiotics stop working, simple infections such as a sore throat, for example, could potentially become fatal, and routine surgeries and key treatments would become very high risk. And I suppose without effective antibiotics in human medicine, you're looking at things like maybe treatment failure, prolonged recovery time, and I suppose ultimately increased mortality rates. And I suppose this isn't an issue that we may encounter into the future. This is something that's currently happening right now. And I suppose at the moment, globally, AMR is responsible for 700,000 deaths per year. And I suppose without any further action, and if AMR continues to spread at current levels, that's estimated to increase to 10 million by 2050. So I suppose there is really a need for a collective approach to tackling AMR, because antibiotic resistance affects everyone. It's not just a particular or a separate problem, say in animal health compared to human health. There is crossover, and it is the one issue.
I think that has provided some really interesting context at the outset of this conversation. And as you say, the practices on individual dairy farms, collectively that can have an impact on AMR, both from an animal and a human perspective. To take a step back, Eamon, and to before we get into the conversation of AMR with you, could you give us a little bit of information about yourself, your dairy farming at home?
Yeah, that's correct. I'm dairy farming here in Cuffs Grange in County Kilkenny, and I'm still holding on to the new entrant title. I suppose we changed over from suckler farming in 2013 and began milking that spring, and we're running. I suppose we're running a 200 cow dairy herd there now that we've increased over the last number of years. I suppose where my interest kind of spurred originally, I was at an Animal Health Ireland conference there one day in Kildalton in 2013, and Dr. Ingrid Lawrence was talking, and she was focusing on the scouring calf and how to treat it. I suppose what struck with me at that point was a drug that I'd been using for years that was, unbeknown to me, was doing a lot of damage to the intestine of the scouring calf. So I suppose that's where I got my interest spurred from that. And I suppose not only was that bolus, it was killing all the bad bacteria that was in the gut, but it was also, destroying all the good bacteria, and it was leaving that gut flora in a very poor state long term. And after I left that meeting that day, I suppose I was wondering what else I thought I was doing right that was actually causing harm and had adverse effects long term in regard to herd health. And I began looking into why and when I used treatments, and what was the outcome, and what was the correct way to treat livestock and improve animal husbandry. And I suppose that day as well, what I learned afterwards was that 85 to 90% of scours are actually non-bacterial, and I was using oral antibiotics, and I've been using the wrong drug all along for the wrong condition, for as long as I could remember. And after that, I suppose we improved our course of action with our young stock, and as our dairy herd increased, I went down the route of selective dry cow treatment, and I think I've just moved on gradually over the years, basing my herd health at the forefront.
Looking then, you didn't just, I suppose, rest on your laurels, Eamon. You sought out some information, you made some changes to your practices, but interestingly, you also did a significant study on the topic of AMR in terms of a Nuffield scholarship. I suppose we've spoken to some fellow Nuffields that you'd be aware of in the past on this show, Ed Payne, Carol Kissan, but can you give us some information about your particular study and maybe some of the learnings from our international counterparts?
I suppose I was fortunate to receive an Nuffield scholarship in 2017, and it allowed me to travel the world really and learn a lot along the way. And I suppose the issue of antibiotics, antibiotic usage in agriculture and its impact, as Róisín has stated already, it's been recognised by the World Health Organization as part of its global plan action, and as being a greater threat than cancer. So it's quite a scary one from that perspective. And I suppose what I learned along the way is that a lot of usage of drugs on farms, they're through prophylactic use, and when a lot of the sectors, especially the pig and the poultry sector, took a step back and decreased their usage of antibiotics, it just showed that antibiotics were being used more so as a crutch rather than a necessity. A lot of the areas that I saw most significant improvements on my travels were probably through the pig and the poultry industry. But I also got the opportunity in Europe to see, the likes of the Dutch, who had taken on selective dry cow therapy a lot earlier than we had at home. They had done it without any really adverse significant issues been caused by it. And one of the areas where they were ahead of us is that, their milk recording from the early 1950s was basically comparable to what we were in 2018 in uptake. So all that information that the Dutch farmers had at hand allowed them to make these decisions based on information that was readily available to them. Now, we had always been, I suppose we had always been milk recording over the last number of years. And it gave me the confidence, I suppose, to use selective dry cow therapy an awful lot more. I'd started in 2016, I suppose, with cows of maybe a threshold of 50,000 of a cell count or less. And after coming back from Holland and seeing what they'd done, cows with a cell count of 200,000 or less over the 4 or 5 tests that I did throughout the year, I was confident enough to use selective dry cow therapy on them also. Now, it's not for the faint-hearted, and the biggest issue that is around all of this is hygiene, and you have to be, I suppose, surgically clean in that regard. And I wouldn't advise anyone just to go down the route of using sealer only without consulting their vet, or even on the basis of speaking with the Animal Health Ireland, because they had a pilot scheme which is offering vets advice to farmers free of charge. So that's definitely a priority before anyone would consider that route.
Outside of say, you've mentioned, I suppose, other enterprises like pigs and poultry. You're also talking about selective dry cow therapy, something that, we're aware of. Looking then to other practices, is there anything else interesting that you saw, internationally that, in ways they're simple farm practices, but it's something that we would miss on our own farms day to day, like we wouldn't necessarily see the problem?
Yeah, well, I suppose most of the farms that I saw that were really on top of their game, what they had from the very start was, a vaccination protocol that was organised alongside their vets. And as we've seen, I suppose, over the last 2 years, the importance of vaccination to herd health is massive, and it takes a lot of the issues away without having to do a whole lot less. The most important thing, I suppose, when it comes down to vaccination is the correct vaccination protocol, and especially for your young stock, to get them in on the correct programs. And I think a lot of the time, vaccines they're used sporadically when there's an issue on farm. No matter what you have to spend, you're going to use it. And then because you haven't had that issue for a couple of years, that I suppose you tend to lose track of why and when you're vaccinating. And again, there's a fire starts with some form of breakdown in herd health, and just we can't afford these issues going forward. But one of the good areas that I saw that's available, and for any farmer setting out, MSD have a herd health vaccination calendar, and you can put in your vaccination program into this calendar. It's free of charge, and then throughout the year you'll get a text message to remind you of when you need to vaccinate. So it's a very good idea to keep that in your mind, and also just simple measures like setting up calendars in your farm office about when your vaccination program should be followed up on. One of the other areas that came to mind as well is I noticed an influx of cow monitoring on my travels, and everything from pedometers to collars on cows. And a lot of this technology is capable of giving you the information of when a cow is on her way down before she's actually sick. So you can get in there early with the likes of anti-inflammatories and fluids. And I think fluids are often underestimated in their ability to resolve a lot of issues, health issues in stock, before it actually becomes a problem.
And I guess, I've heard this, and I think it came from the ICBF, Eamon, and I guess it's in line with what you're talking about. But, genetics creates potential in terms of what an animal can achieve, whether it's growth or milk production. Management can realise that potential, but essentially disease and sickness in animals destroys it. And when you refer to, the overall herd health and creating a plan with the likes of your vet or Animal Health Ireland, therefore you're reducing the risk of that disease and helping animals achieve their potential through, I suppose, proactive management as opposed to reacting to sickness. To you, Róisín, from your knowledge, can you identify where you see the main areas on dairy farms in relation to practices and disease that can lead to resistance of antimicrobials?
Yeah, so I suppose when we're looking at what causes this resistance, I suppose it's important first to look at and understand how AMR, or how this resistance occurs. So if we take, for example, again, our sick animal on the farm, and we use antibiotics to treat this animal, so the bacteria that is responsible for causing this illness or disease is exposed to that particular antibiotic when we use it to treat our sick animal. And I suppose while this antibiotic would kill most of the harmful bacteria responsible for this particular illness, some bacteria may survive. And I suppose the bacteria that survive are resistant bacteria, and these can go on to multiply and create a new population of bacteria that are then more resistant and more difficult to treat. So I suppose, therefore, really, any time antibiotics are used on farm, there is a risk that resistant bacteria can develop and antibiotics become less effective. But I suppose it's particularly the overuse or the misuse of antibiotics that speeds up this process. So the more we use antibiotics, the more chances bacteria have to become resistant to them. So like when we talk about misuse, we're talking about things like maybe a farmer treating a disease in an animal that's caused by a bacteria that's not susceptible to a particular antibiotic. Or if we're using antibiotics to treat diseases that are caused by viruses and other germs that are not going to be susceptible either. Also things like, the blanket use or the routine use of antibiotics, underdosing with antibiotics, or not finishing the treatment of antibiotics. So all of these factors, or all of these things, will increase the risk of resistance developing as a result of increased exposure of bacteria to antibiotics. But I think it's also important just to be clear and just to say that it's not that farmers should never use antibiotics. It's of course important from an animal welfare point of view to treat a sick animal with antibiotics if they require it. But it's more important of how antibiotics are being used, and I suppose keeping antibiotics for this purpose. And I suppose as well as that, not all antibiotics are the same either. There is certain classes of antibiotics that are more important than others. And the reason that they're more important is that they're, I suppose, reserved for use in human medicine because of their ability to treat serious infections which have become unresponsive to other antibiotics. And I suppose these are stronger antibiotics, and they're considered as drugs of last resort. And what they're usually referred to is highest priority, critically important antimicrobials, or HPCIAs. And I suppose a small amount of these are also used on farms, but I suppose given their importance to human health, it's important that their use on farm is limited.
Yes, this is absolutely fascinating. But I guess a couple of points, Róisín, that you've mentioned, it echoes a lot of what Eamon has said. And I think if we focus and we think about our own farm situation, and I suppose your starting point there, it can be overuse or misuse. And a classic example, if we think about a dairy farm, is a cow has mastitis, and are we using the correct tube to treat the strain of mastitis? And then again, you mentioned an animal has a viral infection. Are you using the correct course of treatment? And it is all about educating ourselves and linking up with, I suppose, the relevant experts. And in a lot of cases, it can be our vet and indeed people like the AHI, and there are really good resources that are available to people. I suppose the second point then is following a course of treatment. If it's 3 days the animal is to be treated for, do it for the 3 days. If they seem better after the second day, that you don't just stop it there. Talk through, Róisín, maybe if you have 2 or 3 top tips in terms of steps to prevent resistance to antimicrobials on specific farms. Like, what would you recommend?
When we look at reducing AMR on farm, we're really looking back to the cause of AMR, and I suppose we know that it develops through antibiotic usage. So if we have a healthy herd, healthy animals on the farm, that is going to reduce the need for antibiotics. And I suppose that's going to reduce the risk of AMR developing. So, having, I suppose, healthy animals is going to be a key prevention measure in reducing the development of AMR. And I suppose that just relates back to some of the things that were mentioned earlier in terms of having an effective vaccination program on farm and building up the immunity of the animals on farm as a result. And also things maybe around good biosecurity measures, minimizing animal stress, which we know stress in animals will depress their immune system and make them more susceptible to disease. And again, like things like good farm hygiene to minimize exposure of animals to various, I suppose, bacteria or viruses which have the potential to cause disease and illness. And I suppose, if there is a need for antibiotics to be used on farm, there is some, I suppose, important points there. And there is some recommendations around, I suppose, what's the mindful use, or what's referred to as the prudent use of antibiotics. So, things like getting a correct diagnosis and using the right medicine. So, what's causing the disease or the illness, and what's going to be the most effective treatment. And things like, administering at the correct dose rate for the correct duration, and finishing out that treatment course. And also, I suppose, treating the correct animal. So that might seem pretty straightforward, but, is it only the animal that's suffering from the disease that needs to be treated, or has there been other animals in contact with that sick animal that might require treatment in order to prevent a disease outbreak? So I suppose the key thing is, I suppose, overall animal health. But I suppose if antibiotics are required to be used, that they're used, I suppose, prudently and in the correct way to prevent the buildup of antimicrobial resistance.
And to follow on from that point, and based on the prevention steps that Róisín has mentioned, to you, Eamon, what has changed on your farm in the last 2 or 3 years to achieve that, healthy animal, preventing disease, and I suppose being proactive, where there is illness on farm?
I suppose, Emma-Louise, that one of the main areas, they're all just the basics really when you look at it. And, apart from the hygiene and biosecurity side of things, and I suppose the biosecurity is very important. How often do you see farmers coming from marts or coming onto your farm, and no farmer should be allowed into your farm without having clean attire, disinfecting. And it's just, take a leaf out of the likes of the pig and poultry side of things there. You wouldn't have access to any of their farms without showering and changing. We don't need to be that strict, but just basic hygiene would be a good start. And vaccination is probably one of the main areas that we can focus on. And speak to your vet. If you have an issue on farm, test and find out what the issue is and resolve it through vaccination protocols. And the dry cow period, the diet for your dry cow is so important on the basis that when she calves down, that she's producing really good quality colostrum. And then from the time that she does calf, getting that colostrum into your calf within the first couple of hours of life. And a simple thing like using a Brix refractometer, it's telling you the quality of the colostrum that you're putting into your calf. But it's also, if your colostrum quality is poor, it's also showing you that your dry cow diet isn't adequate. Also, the storage of your colostrum, whether if you're going to use it, it needs to be cooled rapidly after being milked from the cow, or if you're going to freeze it, it needs to be frozen soon afterwards as well. Often you see colostrum sitting around in a bucket all day and being used the following night or the following day. Small, simple areas like that, you're starting your calf off to a really good start in life. One of the other areas that I got involved in maybe this spring as well is Tommy Heffernan, Tommy the vet. You're well aware of him, but he's using microbials, good bacteria for gut health in the calves, and we've been using that very successfully this spring as well. And set your calf up to a good start in life. They build a really good immune system, and those calves in general don't have much of an issue later on in life. And I suppose one of the areas that I've noticed over the last couple of years is the cows that we've been only using selective dry cow therapy on. I do believe there's an improvement in the colostrum that's been used on their calves because there's no residue from any form of antibiotic in that first feed. And that has to be, massively important for gut health. There's probably another Nuffield study in that for anyone if they're interested. But that's, I suppose, my key areas, and Róisín has covered all the rest of it.
And just to delve into that a little bit further, so I suppose there's two things there, and just to go back on the first thing, would you selectively use colostrum from cows that had a sealer only in the autumn as opposed to ones with antibiotics for calves, or are you just, I suppose, feeding the calf their mother's colostrum?
Well, I suppose one of the key areas that the advice on giving the mother's colostrum to the calf will be around Johne's disease. We've tested for Johne's for the last 4 years. We got involved in the pilot scheme with AHI, and fortunately we have no Johne's in the herd. So I would focus on the calves, especially the heifer calves, getting colostrum, that they're getting colostrum from cows that had selective dry cow therapy only, if at all possible.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting aim, and it's something I haven't heard from a dairy farmer before, but it's definitely something for people to consider. As you say, there is a residue in the colostrum of a cow who received antibiotics in the previous lactation. And then the second thing, in terms of the microbes, can you give us a little bit more detail about that, Eamon?
I suppose Tommy Heffernan has been involved with vision farming, where they've been really advocating, I suppose, the use of good bacteria for the likes of calves and well, I suppose animals in general. So one of the areas that we were focusing on this spring is all the calves were getting this good gut bacteria for the first 10 days of life. And I suppose it left a great shine in calves. Now calf health has always been generally good on our farm here, but I think that it definitely has helped. There was no nutritional scours at any stage, even later on, and I think that was it has a role to play. If you think about the gut flora is so sensitive at a calf at that age, it definitely it has to be a big positive for them to set them out in the right path. So we were using that in their milk for the first 10 days, and then also we were putting it in their feed twice a week then thereafter. It's not a big issue. I just had a pump on the top of the drum, so just put that into the calf feeders as they were going.
I think that's a really interesting point, Eamon. And, you would have often heard of farmers going to the local supermarket and getting yogurt to mix it with milk, to feed to calves with scours. So, if that's a product that, can promote healthy guts in young calves, as you say, it can have benefits across their lifetime. I think we could chat for another half an hour, but we'll wrap it up at this stage. This has been a hugely insightful conversation, and I've learned a lot from the two of you. I suppose to make reference to a few things, the MSD herd health vaccination calendar that you mentioned, Eamon, sounds like it could be hugely useful for every dairy farmer. We might link it to the show notes, and as well I'd make reference to Róisín. You've created a very useful resource with some people in curriculum development, James Marr and co, about AMR on the Teagasc website. Again, we will link that. I think it's hugely useful. And finally then your own Nuffield Scholar report, Eamon. Thanks very much, Róisín and Eamon.
Thanks, Emma-Louise.
Thanks very much.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Róisín Horan and Eamon Sheehan for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.